Welcome to a new series I am doing on world building mastery, where I'll teach you everything I have learned about world building over the past 10 years of working in the hobby. All of the episodes will make sense in isolation. However, I would encourage you to check out my other videos, as this will help you with your world building work. Today I will go over why you need conflict in your world building, exactly what it is, the different types of conflict, what makes conflict interesting rather than boring, how to ensure it is interesting, and finally, give you the exact system I recommend to use when creating a setting to ensure that it functions as a conflict generation machine. This will give you endless potential for interesting stories. Let's begin. Part 1. Why you need conflict in your world building. Creating conflict in your world building is one of the most vital and important aspects of creating a setting, as all stories are fundamentally based on conflict. A setting without conflict isn't really a setting, it's just sort of a place. It'll be bland and boring. You need conflict, because all stories are fundamentally a case of this person wants this, other person wants that, this and that are mutually exclusive. Beginner and even experienced world builders can make this mistake. It's something I've often struggled with in my own settings, until I was able to distill it down to the basics and create a system which I will share with you today. Now, having conflict is a prerequisite for an interesting setting, but it is not sufficient for an interesting setting. Because even if you do have conflict, it needs to be interesting conflict. You can have an abundance of conflict and you can still have a boring setting, if the conflict isn't interesting. Conflict also isn't necessarily the same as war and violence, as there are many forms that conflict can take, as we shall see. Fortunately, there are some very easy and straightforward ways to ensure that there will always be an adequate amount of interesting conflict in your setting. I'm going to get into those today. There are no hard and fast rules, as always, but as I say, learn the rules before you break them is always the right advice. These are more like guidelines than actual rules, you know. So, second point, different types of conflict and how to create conflict, and what makes them interesting. What is conflict? So I'm going to give you a definition here. Conflict is what happens when the intentions of multiple forces within the setting are in contradiction of one another. So this person wants this, that person wants that, this and that are mutually exclusive. These forces can be characters and groups, but they don't necessarily have to be. They could also be forces of nature, or things like that. The struggle for survival in a hostile universe is still an example of conflict. So it doesn't necessarily have to be conflict between people. It can be a man versus nature conflict, or a man versus situation conflict. But there are a few main kind of sources of conflict. This isn't necessarily a comprehensive list, but it should still be a very useful list. So you have survival/existential conflict, resource/economic conflict, ideological/religious conflict, and character/personal conflict. All of these can be violent or non-violent. It can be worth deciding on one or more main sources of conflict in your setting early on in your world building process. However, by all means, go all in. This can be a case of just the more the merrier. I think with conflict, the more sources of conflict that you have and the more that they tie in with one another and kind of overlap, the more interesting your work will be. So, it's worth going over Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You should probably be familiar with this already. The idea being that human needs and human intentions are somewhat organized on a hierarchy. Things lower on the hierarchy are more fundamental to survival. So you've got the basic survival needs, food, water, shelter, etc. But as you ascend the hierarchy, they become less about survival, or at least not in a direct sense. So you get social connection, status, and ultimately love and belonging. And as you ascend the hierarchy, you get into things like self-actualization and transcendence. So those are all things that humans need. And conflict can arise out of any of them if the needs of multiple humans contradict one another. So my survival contradicts your survival, for example. Yeah, so worth bearing in mind, the lower on the hierarchy the source of conflict is, the more violent and desperate it is likely to be. Whether you want conflict in your setting to be violent and desperate, which conflict you want to be violent and desperate, is up to you. Not all conflict needs to be violent and desperate. But if you do want violent and desperate conflict, it needs to originate from something lower on the hierarchy. You don't really get a violent and desperate conflict emerging out of disagreement on how city grid layouts should be organized, for example. Like, you don't really get a war fought over that. I mean, you can get a war sparked by that, but we'll get into the details of that. But you don't really get a desperate fight to the death. Like, two men on a desert island are not going to fight to the death with one another just because they voted for different political parties. They're only going to fight to the death if, like, there's a limited amount of food and there's only enough for one of them. So a setting with resource scarcity will always have an easy way to generate conflict, but that doesn't necessarily make it better. Even a setting with an abundance of resources can still generate plenty of interesting conflict if it is caused partially by the other sources higher up on the hierarchy, but also if there are certain resources which are scarce even while most of them are abundant. Because it's always worth bearing in mind, scarcity is relative. And there will always be some kind of scarcity. Even if you have abundance of almost everything, there are still going to be some scarcity relative to those things. So actually, an example of a setting which does that is my own setting, my own science fiction setting of the Grand Unified Federation. And I just want to talk a bit about that. The Grand Unified Federation has an abundance of most basic resources. Energy, raw materials, food, etc. All these things, they're almost post-scarcity in regards to those things. They have an extreme amount of them kind of per person, so every individual within their society will be supplied with all these things. The problem is that because there's so many things per person, relative to that, people are actually the scarce thing. So I thought I would lean into that, and I gave them a kind of demographic issue where their birth rate is very low. And what that means is that fundamentally their constraining power, their constraining limit is actually manpower. So access to human beings, and especially skilled human beings, is the scarce resource in the setting, which defines what you can do. And I find that to be a very interesting resource because it's quite a complex resource, and complex resources are always more interesting. It's not as simple as, oh, this is the fuel that makes, fast and light travel possible. It's actually a case of human beings, with all their complexity, are what defines what you can do. So, for example, you might have, 1 billion people, but if they're not skilled in the right areas, then you still can't necessarily do what you need to. So I thought that was just an example that I wanted to share. And you might find that interesting, maybe some food for thought. But yeah, fundamentally, all you need to do to ensure that you have conflict is have different forces, predominantly groups and characters, within the setting whose interests conflict in these categories. For example, if you have a key resource like the spice melange, which isn't actually just an FTL fuel, it is more complex resource than that. But you have a very easy way to generate resource conflict out of something like that. All the great houses in the Duneverse setting, they want to control the spice melange, but they can't all control it. Only one of them can control it, so they have to conflict with one another for it. However, while this does create conflict, it isn't enough to make the conflict interesting, which leads us into our third point. Part 3. How to make conflict interesting. So I just talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs as well as various categories which conflict can emerge from. You can have resource and economic conflict, you can have an ideological conflict, etc. Stacking different types of conflict on top of one another is a good idea. I think when it comes to conflict, complexity is your friend in some ways. Not always, but the more factors you have, and the more reasons you have for people to be in conflict, the more dynamic and interesting that conflict will be, especially if they also have reasons for wanting to cooperate with one another. So you can have two groups which are conflicting for one goal while also cooperating for another goal, and that can be interesting. But for example, an ideological conflict can actually be sparked by a resource scarcity conflict. Often a war will on paper be fought over one reason, often something higher on Maslow's hierarchy, like ideological reasons or something kind of vague and spiritual. But in reality, the causes will be lower on the hierarchy. It'll be about resource control or something like that. Conflict needs to be thematic. Too many settings, I think, will introduce conflict, but don't consider what thematic purpose that conflict explores or implies. So you need to find out what the thematic purpose or core of your setting is, and which one appeals to you the most. Which one do you find the most interesting? Which one do you think about? And you can have different forces in the setting, especially groups of people, with different beliefs around that theme, which clash with one another. Again, doesn't necessarily have to be through war, but it can be through war. Even something like survival or a resource conflict, which you'd think is quite straightforward in some ways, can still serve an interesting theme. For example, it could serve a theme of what does human nature become when society breaks down, which is a thematic conflict, but not an ideological one. So a thematic conflict doesn't necessarily have to be ideological. And again, Dune is a great example of a thematic conflict and some interesting conflicts arising from a resource conflict, because it's an interesting resource. It's people say it's a spice melange, which is valuable because it's the FTL thing and it allows them to do FTL travel, which yes, it does, but it allows more than that. What's really valuable in it is it's a consciousness expanding tool. And that's actually the key thing, because it's not so much the spice itself that's valuable as it's what the spice does is valuable. And what the spice does is it expands human consciousness and human capabilities. And those are really the key resource that people are fighting over. And that makes it so much more interesting than if the spice was just some kind of thing that they added to the ship's engines and made them go. Yeah, that's something that makes conflict interesting. Now, I would go so far as to say that conflict has to be thematic in order to be interesting. You can have more than one theme, of course, but your setting will always be most interesting if your themes are interesting and also complement one another. So, I'm trying to think of an example of this. I don't know if I could use Dune as an example of this as well. So they have themes in Dune of religion, they have themes of imperialism, they have themes of resources, they have themes of a few others that I'm probably forgetting, war. And there's one kind of planet where all of these themes come together and clash in these forces. That makes it very interesting. So, also, the cool ideas that you bring to your world building, the cool stuff of, giant robots fighting kaiju or whatever, or in the case of Dune, I suppose it would be the sandworms, the shields and the melee combat, all the cool stuff has to complement the theme. Another theme in Dune is actually control, like self-control, discipline, and the Fremen water scarcity thing is actually, I guess, an example of that, because they have control over water, and that's kind of thematic. So you can, the cool ideas serving the theme is an important part of, world building as a whole, but also conflict. So if you make your cool stuff something that complements the theme, that can be an engine for thematic conflict. So if you haven't found your theme yet, think about the cool ideas in your setting and figure out, what themes are those, what themes do those lend themselves to. This ties in with a broader point also of world building is fundamentally a philosophical exercise, and that's something I could potentially make a video about in the future, so let me know if you'd be interested in that. Finally, part 4 here's an exact system that I recommend you use to ensure conflict. This is largely just a summary of everything we've talked about so far, but here's kind of a step-by-step guide. First step is deciding upon a core theme and a core conflict. It should really be the first step, or one of the first steps, in any world building project, in my opinion. If you haven't decided upon it yet, that's fine, because you probably actually have, subconsciously and without realizing it. Again, whatever cool idea you find the most interesting is probably tying in with your core theme. So figure out what the core theme of your setting is. All settings have a theme, just as all stories do, whether the author originally set out with that intention or not. Preferably come up with a list of themes, which you find interesting and which complement one another, and go with that. Next, consider how different forces within your setting might reflect that theme. For example, if you have a theme of wanting to explore imperialism, there are some obvious forces in a setting which you could introduce which serve that theme. So you could introduce competing empires, natives who they colonize, specific resources which are vital for trade and power. There are political, economic, cultural, and natural forces which all impact that theme. There's multiple dimensions to it, and there's multiple ways you could explore that. Perhaps the theme you want to explore is Darwinism and how evolutionary psychology affects human nature. You could introduce forces of beings or humans which act purely on instinct and are animalistic, contrasted by those who suppress their natural instincts and try to remain civilized. You could introduce various creatures into the setting which have a kind of ecosystem to them. You can go in different directions with things. Next, you need to make sure that these various forces, which all have different takes on it, are in contradiction of one another and are in contact with one another. Again, these can be factions and they can be sub-factions or characters, but they can also be forces of nature or, anything really. Even unconscious natural forces can contribute to a philosophical conflict. So after you've written down your core theme and written down a series of conflicting takes, which predominantly serve that core theme, but you can throw in a few wild cards. Studying philosophy will help you with this, by the way, but that's just me, I guess. Once you've come up with a number of conflicting beliefs or takes that people on the setting will have surrounding that core theme, or surrounding anything really, but especially the core theme, and you put them in contact with one another, conflict will arise naturally. The higher on Maslow's hierarchy that this conflict originates from, the less violent it will be, and the lower it originates from, the more violent it will be. Different groups need to have conflicting interests and not just conflicting beliefs. So again, think about it in terms of Maslow's hierarchy. Interests are really about survival and control, and what benefits one group may not benefit another. Finally, it can be a good idea to have some kind of dial, like controlling the heat on a stovetop. This is a very useful tool. So imagine you have a setting with 5 superpowers locked into a Cold War. Now imagine that you have some vital resource which all of those superpowers need in order to survive. Whatever it might be. Maybe it's food, or maybe it's fast and light travel fuel, or maybe it's magic rocks for super weapons, or dragons, or whatever it is. Now imagine that the supply of this resource is highly volatile, like a stormy sea. So one moment you might have an abundance of it everywhere, and the next it might be very scarce and only a few people have access to it now. And the next it can be abundant again. So for whatever reason, the supply of this resource is very volatile. This necessarily gives you a kind of dial, because when you want the resources, when you want life to be good, when you want conflict, or violent conflict at least, to be kept to a minimum, you can have the resource be abundant. And when you want violent conflict to erupt suddenly, you can suddenly have the resource become scarce. So you can flip between the non-violent and the violent conflict a lot in that setting. And that could make the 5-way Cold War type idea so much more interesting. This is kind of like oil, to be honest. But we always take inspiration from the real world. So here's a checklist for you. Core themes for the setting. Check. A variety of factions which hold different beliefs regarding that core theme. Check. Do the various factions have genuinely contradictory interests regarding what happens in the world? Check. A variety of non-human forces which also complement that theme. Check. Sources of conflict on every level of Maslow's hierarchy. Check. Some form of resource scarcity, i.e. certain resources which are both essential and of which there is some scarcity. Check. Some kind of tangible existential threat, which can create scarcity and thus lead to conflict. Check. If you have all of these things, you will always be able to create interesting conflict in your setting. So I hope this video has been helpful to you. If it has, make sure to check out the description, where you can join my world building mastery community. I'm making a full course on world building which will be posted there very soon. I want to build a community of talented world builders and writers from whom the next great artists of our generation will be born. I want to create the greatest community of world builders that exists on the internet. That is the mission statement of World Building Mastery. So it's all very exciting, and I hope to see you there soon. In any case, thank you for watching, and I'll have more content to come. Bye!